famous. They were sort of short-haired kind of terrier dogs, not unlike that dog, I'm going to say. That dog's been brought along especially. They look just like that, as you'll see in a moment. And these dogs were essentially, they were just... And these dogs were used for hunting. They were being trained especially to be lookout dogs. But what there didn't seem to be a lot of interest in is actually looking after them. So the dogs just ran wild around Quarry, really. Not a lot of dogs on leads. They were just left to their own devices. And again, it's an element of that kind of like rugged individualism, to call it, you know, to be very romantic about it. Awkward, pain in the arse, whatever you want to call it. But there was certainly people had a sense that they were a law unto themselves here. Going back to the children, there was a sense, and again, it was a sense of moral panic. We spoke about it earlier with the church, the sense that this area needed to be saved in some way. So for a long time, the children were educated at St Andrew's School on the London Road. There were some boundary changes in the late 19th century, and the school just here was built to educate the children of Quarry. And there was a sense that these kids needed to be disciplined. And they brought in a head teacher, very famous head teacher called Mr. Bickley. Mr. Bickley was head teacher here in 1892, and in his first year he was assaulted twice. Not by the children, by the adults. Again, Mrs. Gregson told me not a great story, but it's really true that he was quite handy with a cane, Mr. Bickley, and she said that one night he came out of the doorway just there, and there was a welcoming committee for him, and they beat him up. They beat him up on multiple occasions. They said if there's any hitting to be done, it was the parents of Quarry that were going to actually do that. So, which you do think, if that maybe happened now, maybe with the passage of time it seems quite romantic, but I'm sure at the time it was not very good for Mr. Bickley at all. So you have this sort of lawlessness around here, or at least a perceived lawlessness, hard drinking, those sorts of things. And I'll bring in a bit of my family now. So, there we go. This is outside the Masons pub. Probably taken about 1905. There's the Masons. Taken about 1905. Paul's Brewery, local brewery, just there. They're all sat about there. You can see the alleyway, there they all are, they're all set there. So this is my family, that's my lot just there. In the centre, that's my great-grandfather, that's William Goodall, he was the landlord. Sitting next to him is Rose Goodall, his wife. Interestingly, William Goodall wasn't from Quarry, he was from St Aldate's. He was a cap and gown maker, and he moved up here. I'm not really sure why, but he moved up here. Maybe it was love brought him here, although Rose was from Standlake. And they came up here and they ran the pub. At that time, the pub would have been essentially one room at the front with drinking. At the back, there was a sweet shop, and I think there was a faggot and pea shop as well that they ran. Notice the dogs. This guy here is a guy called Gaffer Kerry, and what you find is that, and this is another interesting thing about the area, is that there were lots of people who had the same surnames. There were lots of people, lots of big families here. And the Kerrys were a big family, the Girls were a big family, the Traffords were a big family. And just in doing the research for this, I can do loads of nicknames, but we've got, so there's Gaffer Kerry just there, that's his nickname. We've got Tiddle Kerry, we've got Gaffer Kerry, Crowy Kerry, Stunt Kerry, Scabs Girl, Mucky Girl, Pinch Plum Coppock, that's a great one, Moggy Coppock. There's loads and loads and loads of them. They all had nicknames. Maybe the nicknames help with avoiding the law, I don't know. But so we're running the pub. Again, you can see the dogs, he's even got a puppy there on his lap. So the dogs were very, very well regarded. Poor Rose, I always look at Rose and I think she just looks knackered. And she's probably knackered because she's got 5 more pregnancies to go. There's my great uncle Buster, is just sat on the floor. There's the eldest, Aunt Nell, just there. Auntie Annie's sat on her lap. But again, after that, there comes Uncle Jim, Auntie Lou, Aunt Sel, Aunt Dorothy. I don't know. There's 5 more. There's 5 more of them. So Gaffer Kerry would have been one of the Quarry roughs. Luckily, before my grand died, I asked her about this photograph and she was able to fill me in about who most of the people are. I said, why do they call him Gaffer Kerry? She said he was in charge. So I suppose that gives you an idea of like his status. The Kerrys, big poaching family. They were always up at Shotover, bringing rabbits and pheasants down to feed people. Again, Cliff Gurley used to run the Masons, Boxer Girl, back in the 70s and 80s. He would always. I've heard an interview with him with saying people in Quarry grew up on rabbit. Rabbit was vital for the diet. So, poor old William Goulord. He's a cap and gown maker. He looks quite smart. I always think he looks quite dapper. He obviously had a bit more cash than the others. He dies. He dies about age 40. I'm not sure. He's in his 40s. He's not very old. Rose has to leave the pub. She can't be the landlady of the pub on his own. That's not allowed. So she looks around. She's got to marry somebody else. She doesn't actually look that far because she marries Charlie Girl, who's actually sat next to her. I'm not sure quite what was going on there. I don't know if he died in suspicious circumstances, poor William. But she married Charlie Girl. And Charlie Girl, if you look at the picture, he's a bit rougher. He is a proper Quarry rough. He's got that necktie round. You see some of these lads have got neckties round. Don't know if that signifies anything, but Charlie was a well digger. Again, running water didn't come to this area till just before the First World War, so digging wells was the only way you were going to get water. He's a well digger. The family story is that they were very keen upon finding him just before he finished his jobs, because if he finished his job and he got paid and you didn't catch him, you might not see him for 2 weeks because he would go out on a drinking bender. My dad said in later life, because he didn't know his grandfather, he died, so he knew Charlie as kind of his surrogate grandfather. He'd say in later life, Charlie would say to him, George, can you give me a latcher? And a latcher was the amount of money for 1 pint of beer. So a latcher allowed you to lift the latch, to go into the pub, to sit down, nurse a pint, and then hope somebody else would come in and buy you another one. So it was a bit of a chancer there. Buster on the carpet, probably one of the last old Quarry boys. I never met him. He could never read. Couldn't read or write. But as my dad said, always seemed to have some money. Always seemed to have something to sell. Always seemed to be going to see something to buy something. Because one of the sad things about this picture, and what not sad, maybe that's the wrong word to use, but this is really the end of the Quarry in lots of ways, because a big change was going to come for all these people. Up until this point, like I say, people had made their money through. They were living here. They made their money through odd jobs. There was occasional building work at the university. There were the brickworks at Titup and the brickworks at Kiln Lane, where bricks were made by hand. The local clay was very good. Often people were employed to actually tread the clay by foot, a bit like treading grapes, to soften it up. But again, this was seasonal work. It wasn't regular work. There was also seasonal work in terms of harvesting. But again, there was no big land around here they could rely upon. So the women were asked to take in washing. That was considered to be women's work, and you had huge, big cottage industry in terms of ironing, like I say, washing, ironing clothes. The men would have carts. They would transport the washing to and from the university. There'd be the gardening to do. You could have allotments and that sort of thing. Also, as well, you would have kind of occasional work. Oh, some of these guys, as well, it's fair to say, did travel. They were used to working in the pits, and though the work in the pits was occasional, they did have some skills, some basic masonry skills. Some of these guys would go away, they work on infrastructure projects, say in London, digging out the Metropolitan Railway line, doing those sorts of things. They would go up to some, watch out, there's a motor. So there were lots of people who had secondary incomes and were able to sort of make ends meet in that way. The other thing I should just mention, actually, I just thought about that, so I didn't mention it earlier on. We talk about people being awkward and people about the sort of individualism, the radicalism here. The people who lived here didn't like authority, that was obvious. and they lived by their own rules, and there was some rough justice being meted out. Poor Mr. Bickley, and I suspect other people were subject to that rough justice. They also didn't like Conservatives at all, and there are multiple examples. Certainly in 1892, the Conservative candidate came to the village and was chased out, and the police were pelted with stones. In 1909, during the People's Budget, the Conservatives had a Conservative van that trawled around Oxford. That it did so successfully. It came to Quarry, where the locals actually turned it over and they smashed it up, and they sent the Conservatives packing. So there's a big liberal tradition here. So again, whether it was just bloody mindedness, but there was this sense of individualism. But as I say, for these people, it really was all about to change. And the reason it changed was because in 1905, just down the road, down the hill, at Long Wall Garage, there was a guy called William Maurice, and he was playing about with cars. And in 1913, a couple of miles that way, he set up a factory in an obscure little place called Cowley. And by the 1920s, he needed lots and lots and lots of workers. And suddenly all these boys who've been poaching, doing occasional jobs, doing all these kind of things, they had the option of very good blue-collar jobs at the factory, and that's where they went. And if they had building skills, they could be utilised in the new estates that were being built to house the workers to go in William Morris's factory. So estates like Florence Park, New Headington, Risinghurst. Suddenly, in very, very short order, Quarry became part of Oxford, because Oxford grew up around it, and the infrastructure grew up around it. And these guys who have been living this, fairly life of Riley in some ways. I think the women work really hard. They just seem to produce masses of children and work in laundries. The guys seem to just do a little bit of this, little bit of that, bit of poaching, and then go on the booze for a few weeks. So, but it just shows you that when they did have the option of really good settled work and employment, that's where they did. And that's why when I was growing up in the Quarry, this was an area full of car workers, and there would be hundreds of bikes that would go along the bypass to the factory, along the cycle path. So that quarry ended, really, and by the 1930s, Quarry was now officially part of Oxford. It wasn't this unique little place on the edge of town. But it did survive, and those memories did survive. And the reason we know most about this area is because of a guy called Raphael Samuel, who was a Marxist historian. And in the 1960s, he sat in that pub over there, and he wrote down, he spoke to some of these guys who were still alive, all the stories, and he wrote it down in this book, Village Life and Labour, because Raphael Samuel had this idea about history from the bottom. He thought that the history of everyday life was as important as kings and queens and great battles. So there's a great chapter in here all about the Quarry Roughs. It's called The Quarry Roughs, Life and Labour in Headington Quarry, 1816 to 1820, an essay in oral history. It starts off here, where is it? Headington Quarry, a village now swallowed up by Oxford's suburban expansion, was 70 years ago still quite a primitive place. So it's well worth digging out, although I will say with this book that there is some romantic Marxist stuff going on here about what this place was like, about some sort of proletarian paradise. And also, you do have to be careful with this book. These are the recollections of people, and there have been other essays to say that just because somebody said it was true doesn't mean to say it was true. There may be an edited version, but that's a really, really useful kind of resource and the oral history that we kind of had. I'll pass these little bits and bobs around. It's not very much. This is just a little. This is something my grandma always kept, and it's just something that was delivered to Mrs. G East, number 4 School Place, Headington Quarry, near Oxford. So that's probably from the 20s. Do you want to pass that one round? There's a few pictures here. There's a picture of Uncle Buster in the back garden of the Masons when he got a bit older. There's my grandmother just there. There's Rose Goodall in later life, ended up living in Barton. There's Charlie Goodall. There's Uncle Buster a little bit later, when he got a bit older. There's my grandfather. Anyway, there's a few pictures there if you want to have a look at those. But you'll remember this is a bit of technology that may or may not work. This may be a disaster, but let's hope it isn't. So, do you know I said earlier on about where people came from and about where potentially they lived? There's this idea about there was the Cornish gypsies, and there was this whole kind of like idea about they come from there. So I want to get on the right spot. So when I was doing some research for this, there was something that my parents always told me about, and that was this idea of the Quarry anthem. That Quarry actually has got an anthem, which, when you think about it, for a small village, it's a bit like Passport to Pimlico. The idea that they would have their own anthem, the idea maybe they had their own flag and their own passport, but they did have this thing called the Quarry anthem, and the Quarry anthem is a song called the White Rose. It's a folk song, and when I was looking into the origins of the White Rose, I couldn't find any reference to it. Very, very tricky, until I started delving into Cornish folk songs, and it's a Cornish folk song, it turns out, and it's very famous in Cornwall, and it's very popular in Cornwall. And my mum and dad would tell me stories about going up to the Chequers on a Saturday night. There'd be a piano there, and somebody would shout out, "Come on, let's give us the Quarry anthem," and the whole pub would start singing the White Rose, which I find quite touching, quite uplifting. And I think it kind of points to the fact, a bit of hubris, that people around here thought that they deserved an anthem, but also really uplifting, that they had enough independence, enough sort of self-awareness to feel as if they were a distinct village with a distinct identity. So hopefully this is going to play. Let's see if it does. Oh. There we go.
I love the white rose in its splendor. I love the white rose in its bloom. I love the rose, the sweetest that grows. 'Tis the rose that reminds me of you. The first time I met you, my darling, your cheeks were as red as the rose, but now they are faded and gone dim. They're as white as the lily that grows. I love the white rose in its splendor. I love the white rose in its bloom. I love the rose, the sweetest that grows. 'Tis the rose that reminds me of you.
So that was recorded in the Masons. That was on a BBC documentary years ago. That's me singing now.